Today's conference is part of the Architectural League's 5,000-Pound Life initiative, which is a multi-year project on architecture, climate change, and our economic future that is not focused just on the idea of building buildings and what architects can do by creating net zero buildings or other sustainable buildings, but what we hope to do is to intensify and expand the way that architects and others think about climate change and the role of designers in addressing it. In June of this year, we had the first two programs in this transportation series on aviation and sea shipping, and the documentation of those programs, the videos of the speakers and so on is online at archleague.org, along with a lot of other material from earlier programs in the 5,000-Pound Life, and I hope you will take a look at it. I suspect that for some of you, this is the first conference you've ever been to on autonomous vehicles and driverless freight delivery and the impact of ride-hail services. But I am equally sure for others of you, it's maybe the 10th or 20th conference on these subjects. These issues are visible on our streets and in the news, and they're in the air as a compelling topic of discussion because innovation is happening very rapidly, as is the growth in competition for market share and for regulatory clarity in transportation. And it's happening in New York, and I think it's especially impactful here because it's in the context of one of our periodic crises in the quality of our public transportation. So there's plenty to talk about today, even as many other people in other venues and on other occasions are talking about these issues as well. We have a fascinating day ahead of us, coming at the issues from a number of different disciplines, including design, public policy, sociology, and history. What we intend to be a continuous thread through the day is a consistent questioning of what these new technologies and critical and policy approaches mean in terms of action to mitigate the causes of climate change, to lessen the production of greenhouse gases that we so urgently need to do. The most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I'm sure you're all aware, from early October makes clear that if we want to keep warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade and have a hope of avoiding drastic changes in our climate and our planet and its ability to support us, we have to act transformatively and we have to act now. How we choose to move ourselves and the goods we produce and consume will be a big part of that. As we get started, I want to thank Daniel Aldana-Cohen and Jesse LeCavalier, our moderators today, and for our programs. They also were involved in our programs on aviation and sea shipping, and I want to thank them for working with us over the last 9 months or so to help think through how to structure these conversations. You have in your programs biographies of all of today's speakers, so we're going to rely on you reading these and move right into the presentations. Our first speaker, Anthony Townsend, has been doing a lot of work on autonomous vehicles and their potential impact for cities and what cities can do to channel and guide that impact. So please join me in welcoming Anthony.
Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I haven't worked with the Architecture League in quite a while, but I just want to recognize them. They supported a project, I think it was almost 10 years ago now, as part of the Sentient City program that we did that was exploring co-working in public space in New York City. And there was a time when we had to explain to people what co-working was. And now we're in a city where I think WeWork is like the single largest commercial tenant occupier of office spaces, and has like completely redefined work and redefined how we use buildings. So it's a great testament to the kind of vision that they have in identifying changes that are happening in the city and helping people explore them early on and figure out what they mean. So continuing in that vein, here to talk about transportation, particularly automation in transportation and what it might mean for sustainability and particularly the amount of carbon that we're pumping into the atmosphere. I have had the opportunity over the last year and a half to work primarily with Bloomberg Philanthropies and also with the Aspen Institute and a network of 10 cities that they convened as part of their initiative on autonomous cities and autonomous vehicles, to try to understand and articulate what a pro-urban vision of automotive mobility could look like. If you have gone to these conferences and read what's in the press, the discourse about this technology is really dominated by the auto industry and the IT industry, and what they think this technology is for, how it should be built, who should use it, and how they should use it. And while there are voices that are articulating a more sustainable, kind of progressive, urban-focused vision, they're slowly gathering steam, and they haven't really taken over the conversation globally yet. And so this is our attempt to do this. So I'm just going to go through sort of some of the general trends that we came to understand to get our heads around this, what's happening, to help mayors and other officials understand really big picture where the technology is headed, what its impacts might be, and then to start to think through some desirable scenarios to create alternative narratives about the future that they would want to push forward that are more consistent with their existing mobility goals. And then we'll talk about a little speculation, and really this is all speculation. Very little of this is actually here, which is what makes it hard to talk about, and the timelines keep getting rolled back. If you're following the development of this technology, we're right now in what tech forecasters call the trough of disillusionment. We've gone through a tremendous period of hype around the potential of vehicle automation, and not a lot of that has gotten delivered. The delivery dates keep getting rolled back, and we're not quite clear what's going to happen next. But the next stage is sort of delivery, and it happens more slowly than we initially anticipated. So a lot of this first bit comes from a primer that we published back in March 2017. I have URLs for all this stuff at the end. It's all online, and you can grab it. And this is really like the briefing book. We're trying to understand what is the expert consensus on when AVs are coming, what they're going to look like, how many there will be, where there will be, what they will cost, who's going to make them, what they'll be capable of. Looking across the reports that were coming out of, investment banks and tech forecasters and think tanks, and what tech companies were saying, what the automakers were saying, what startups were saying, just really digesting a tremendous amount of information. And we came to a number of general conclusions. The first one of which was, this is sort of what the timeline looks like for AV deployment. Not a lot happens in the next 10 years, and then boom, there they are. Mostly taxi cabs at first, kind of a very quick conversion of most of the world's taxi fleet, and then first luxury vehicles, and then very quickly spreading into the rest of the fleet over the next couple decades. This is kind of what the introduction of any consumer electronics device looks like, and in many ways the spread of AVs looks more like consumer electronics than it looks like a transportation technology, because if you've ever been inside a Tesla and popped it into autopilot mode, it kind of feels like driving an iPad. You're inside a computer that happens to have wheels and a motor. You're not really inside something that Henry Ford would have recognized as a car. And that's how they're sold and marketed, and in many ways it's how they're built too. It's where most of the value is in the software. And as I looked more at this and started to understand how this was going to play out in the history of surface transportation, I started to think about it in these three phases, or three eras of the automobile. If you look at sort of the 1920 to 1980 period, from when automobiles first started arriving in big numbers in this country, to when we sort of filled up the road network at the end of the 70s. This is when you start to see like a lot of US cities really start having major traffic congestion problems. Granted, some had it before then, but this is when like most of them start having big problems. It's about 60 years. The next 40 years is really the period where a lot of us have come of age, where you see cities start to push back and people start to look for alternatives. This is what has given rise to sort of the current moment, I think, that we're in, which is a lot of resistance to further motorization, a lot of search for alternatives, in certain places pushing back and taking back space and money and attention that was devoted to automobiles and putting it into transit and other alternatives, building differently, behaving differently, pricing, making policy differently. And it's really all about saturation of the road network. And that's been about 40 years. And if we say that automation is going to kick in 2020, and I think, and many others think, be more or less complete enough that it will really change the way most of us travel, change the way we buy automobiles, change the way traffic moves, change the profile of demand on the surface transportation system. That'll mostly be done by 2040. So if you look at just sort of what's happening, it's getting shorter each time. And I think this is really scary for planners and designers, because we're not even really fully finished dealing with the unwinding of the first period, let alone working our way through what we've tried to accomplish in the second period. And now here comes this technology that's going to show up with some really destabilizing sudden effects in just a span of 20 years. So the reason I show this chart is to show people that, like, the kinds of disruptions, to use the tech term, that came with things like ride sourcing, Uber, now happening with things like scooters and scooter share, are not like one-off events that will hit planning institutions and the planning profession and urban communities, and then we'll deal with them and return to a new equilibrium. They're sort of, the first impacts of bigger things to come that automation is going to carry with it. And how we deal with those things and how we retool our organizations and our practices is going to affect whether we get good outcomes or bad outcomes. To just kind of hammer that point home, you can think of us as sitting in the middle of two of the biggest industries in the world coming at each other with claws. The car industry and the computer industry are basically seeing their future in each other and trying to devour each other right now. This is only going through 2016. We haven't brought this up to date yet, but this is just an example of the acquisitions and mergers and cross investments that are going on between car companies and tech companies and all the startups that are sitting in between them, trying to figure out who they're going to go to bed with and what possible deal they can get. And the amounts of money that are thrown around are just astonishing. It's hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's getting bigger and bigger as we go along. So that's sort of the global situation, and it's pretty astonishing. It's exciting because when you look at, like, the problem of fixing cars, this is just this terrible thing that's taken a century to get us into. Well, now what this shows us is that the energy and the resources are there to fix it, but we have to steer it in the right direction. And many people are starting to wonder. This is the obvious question from an urban planning point of view: is well, what's the big picture? What does this mean? What is the autonomous vehicle going to do to cities? That's kind of our knee-jerk frame of thinking about this, that I think a lot of people have come to it with. And, the first response is, well, it's going to loosen the glue that binds cities together. People will get in their cars and go to sleep, or, watch Netflix and, live in the Poconos or central Pennsylvania and work in Manhattan, and it'll all be fine for them. It'll be an easy life. And that's what Tesla and General Motors are going to make possible. And it will really exacerbate the same forces that have pushed sprawl There's another point of view which hasn't been as well articulated, but if you go back to things like Futurama in the 1939 World's Fair, also GM's vision of high-rise cities powered by automated driving, that automation can be a tool. Automated private passenger vehicles could be a tool for high-density cities around this kind of skyscraper freeway model. So that's a possibility too. I think this binary thinking is really distracting. It's oversimplified, and it's not asking the right questions, and it's not really going to get us anywhere. And neither of these things are actually what is going to happen. I found myself early on seduced by this. It was an easy way to start thinking about it. In 2014, published a set of scenarios under the title of Reprogramming Mobility, where we looked at what could happen and actually tried to hypothesize who might some of the actors be that would push us towards some of these scenarios, and picked Google as the driver of a essentially solar-powered self-driving sprawl scenario. This was inspired by a kind of random paper that I saw at the time by two researchers from New Zealand who did some back-of-the-envelope math and kind of came to the conclusion that low-density sprawl was actually the best way to balance rooftop solar panel capacity and electric vehicle recharging capacity, that you could sort of spread the load and spread the capacity out. And I thought, well, okay, so if they're saying you can have a green electric vehicle grid at low density, and what I knew about Google at the time was that they kind of liked the suburban Californian lifestyle. They had bought Nest, so they had a energy business in the home. They had Google Fiber. They were working on self-driving cars. They sort of had all the pieces of the puzzle to build their own town. So we imagined Google building their own exurban new towns and getting into bed with a state Department of Transportation to build an automated lane and sort of managing that infrastructure through a public-private partnership. And, built up a narrative, totally plausible, step by step, how this could play out. It seemed to make sense. I think this is where these futures start to get really interesting, is not when you talk about the technology, but when you talk about how the technology starts to solve problems for stakeholders in the transportation system, and particularly when you start to talk about how it solves fiscal problems for stakeholders in the transportation system, especially public institutions, which in this country have constant fiscal problems that need to be solved. So follow the money and figure out how automation makes the money flow, and you will figure out what is likely to happen. But I think what happened as we started to explore these sort of linear, okay, so let's just think of the AV as a better automobile, as a reinvented automobile, as many people will, started to realize how limited that thinking was. And what's really the fundamental, I think, breakthrough of automated vehicles is that it's really about exploding the box. For all intents and purposes, very little has changed since the Model T. It's still 4 wheels, more or less 4 seats, a steering wheel, brakes, accelerator, headlights, rubber tires. The automobile has not changed a lot in 100 years. But automated vehicles are going to change significantly. And you can already see, this diagram was sort of our way of expressing the fact that the variety of vehicles that we're going to see moving around on streets is going to change tremendously. as automated driving technology spreads. And I would propose to you that this is mostly going to be a good thing for cities, that you can trace a lot of the roots of what's bad about automobiles for cities to the fact that it's not a flexible thing. It's a product whose form has kind of imposed changes on cities rather than the other way around. And that's something that can change very quickly now with automation. If you just look at the variety of vehicle types, and this again is a couple of years old, doesn't reflect the full range of what we're seeing. There are just a huge variety of vehicles, both existing types that are being retrofitted with automation and new types that are emerging as well. So the two on the sides here, passenger cars being turned into automated taxis, or what the OECD calls taxi bots. Trucks being turned into software trains, which is a great term, but also new types of vehicles. There's two French companies, both partly owned by railcar manufacturers, that are building and selling these driverless shuttles, 8 to 10 passenger driverless vehicles that are specifically designed as last mile connectors to move slowly between, on short hops between urban destinations. And what we used to call delivery bots, we now call conveyors that are small, pint-sized robots that are intended for last mile, very quick response delivery runs, and are really, the solution that many cities, I think, are looking for when they're trying to replace large numbers of trucks running around half empty constantly throughout the day, spewing pollution and causing safety problems and generating a lot of noise and traffic. So there's also a lot of opportunities to rethink land use that are coming as both the kinds of vehicles and the number of vehicles change, because the way that these vehicles will be deployed and operated is going to change as well. So there have been a number of really optimistic forecasts, for instance, about the reduction in size of taxi fleets and the reduction in the number of private vehicles that cities will need. This is, you'll probably hear more from Bruce Schaller about this later, but if it's easy to hail a taxi, people may be less likely to own a second car or even to own a first car. And the parking requirements in cities can change, and just the sort of amount of parking that can be fracked or recovered is just astonishing. This is a shot from Savannah College of Art and Design. Did a project last year where they challenged students to reimagine what they might do with kind of pop-up interiors inside a parking deck in Atlanta. And these are experiments that are going on all over the place. There's lots of work going on around the world, thinking about retrofitting, redesigning, repurposing parking structures, parking lots. There are hedge funds that are starting to map out and invest in parking, trying to understand, what the spread between the present value and the future value of urban parking is, and how to financialize that and turn that into something they can pocket, because they know it's going to be recaptured as these technologies change the mobility landscape. And this is just a hint of kind of the structural changes in the city to come. So I'm going to spend the bulk of the presentation talking through a couple of scenarios that we put together, which I think put a little more teeth on this and make it a little more intimate. These were done for the Bloomberg work, really to try to get away from these technical planning, top-down driven, planners' priorities, what's going to happen to parking, or industry priorities. What are we going to put these capabilities to use for? We have this hammer. What are the applications for it? And to think instead about what people's existing mobility problems are and how some of these technologies might actually produce better solutions for those. We also threw in a handful of cases where we knew that a successful use of automation was going to create a new urban problem. So those annoying little delivery bots or conveyors, they're already being tested in cities, and they're already driving people crazy as they crawl down sidewalks. What's going to happen when there's thousands of them? We wanted to sort of anticipate that. So we assembled kind of a focus group of people from the future. They have a variety of different profiles. And this was the product of a couple workshops that we did. And, we've published a flip book, illustrated flip book of these. My 10-year-old daughter actually reads this all the time now, which tells me that it's the perfect reading level for a mayor. So I feel like we've accomplished kind of what we set out to do in terms of making this accessible. But it's a really complicated set of technology and policy issues to a broad audience. And we're trying to make a number of points, and they all, in some way have, I think, pretty important statements about sustainability embedded in them, because at the end of the day, there's some really deep tensions here that I think need to be reconciled. And foremost among those is the fact that what this industry wants to do, the industry that's trying to create these solutions, more than anything else, is to make it easier and cheaper for people to travel. Okay? And if we do that at our current level of carbon emission per mile, we're going to emit more, right? Thankfully, one of the things that comes along with automation is electrification. So there's a good chance that these miles are going to be lower emission miles. Sharing often becomes easier, so there's a possibility that we're going to be utilizing vehicles more, so there's some gains there. But overall, the fundamental driving force that's pushing this forward is more travel. At the same time that everything that's being done on the planning policy side is reduce travel, try to demobilize, try to push people into, far lower carbon intensity modes of moving. And we already see evidence that some of the services that are out there, like ride sourcing and scooters, are stealing riders from lower carbon modes like transit and even walking. A third of scooter riders that are surveyed have been telling us that they would have walked if the scooter share wasn't available. So we really need to pay attention to this, that as these services are rolled out, that on net, we're actually getting people into a lower energy consumption. So one of the myths, I think, that's out there that's a really big myth that needs to be deconstructed is the idea that simply sharing taxis is going to solve all the problems. There's a whole bunch of studies that have been done that try to paint a future that if we can only automate all the taxis and make sure all taxi rides are shared, we can get rid of all private cars, sort of not do anything different with the transit system, and everything will be fine. And the math just doesn't add up. You get kind of a runaway generation of traffic. Bruce will talk about that later, I'm sure. He's really, I think, one of the people who's putting the nail in the coffin of that case. You get a lot more emissions, whatever technology you're using for the vehicles. And you leave a lot of people behind who can't afford taxi fares, which are always going to cost more than transit, no matter how cheap automation makes them. And so what we proposed in this scenario was to think more about the long tail of the taxi market and to think about how subsidies can be used in a world where taxi rides can be tracked and we can take a little piece of the fare from one ride and use it to subsidize somebody else's ride for a social purpose. In this case, a disabled elderly person headed to the doctor, and to try to understand, how is the market for taxi services evolving to serve people with special needs. And you already see this. There are Uber has tools for people who want to manage rides on behalf of people with special needs. I forget what they call it. They call it Uber Dashboard or something like that, or Uber Groups. There are ride sourcing services for people who want to have their children carted around, young children. There are ride sourcing services for senior citizens. So the idea that we're just going to have the same sort of general purpose taxi in the automated future, when we can have specialized vehicles for wheelchairs, we can have specialized crew, because driverless does not mean crewless. When we get rid of the driver with a computer, we free up that resource to bring in a different skilled person. In this case, maybe someone who can provide some care on the way to the doctor. So what we imagined is a much richer array of point-to-point ride-for-hire services emerging, thanks to the convenience and the reduced cost of operating automated taxis. And some of these might be luxury services, some of them might be subsidized services. We have another one that's basically food runs from food deserts, urban food deserts, out to supermarkets. And we published this back earlier in the year, and no sooner had we published this than Waymo announced that they would be doing just that when they launched their service in their driverless taxi service in Phoenix. They're going to drive people, pick people up and take them to Walmart for free so that they can do their shopping at Walmart. People that don't have access to groceries. Another scenario looked at transit. There's a lot of worries that ride sourcing is already competing really head-on with certain parts of the transit network, particularly off-peak bus service. If you only focus on further automation of taxis and don't look at what automation can do for the transit system, we might further weaken that core. So we wanted to look at what can automation do for plain old city buses, and propose this idea of what if we took the technology that has been proposed for long-haul trucks, what they call convoys, where the trucks can use AV technology to follow each other closely in these very efficient, I think they use 20% less fuel, very efficient software trains. They're not physically coupled together, they're virtually coupled together, and apply that to city buses. Essentially, you're building a light rail train out of virtually coupled coaches. And we set this in Sao Paulo, which was one of the cities in the Bloomberg network that just relies heavily on buses, has not been able to subsidize a sustained construction program for subways. And imagine, well, what if you could deploy rail-like capacity using this technology, and bolster your transit network with automation. You can also do all kinds of interesting things, like they can split up and two cars can go to one destination, one car can go to another destination. You can smooth the ride out so that the bus will actually feel as good as a rail ride. You won't have a brake pumping driver. You can have more active suspension. You can narrow the lanes because the computer can drive more precisely than a human being can, so you don't need as much land for the right-of-way. So it's easier to push a BRT corridor through a neighborhood. All these little kind of incremental things make the whole case easier. And again, this was an idea we threw out there, and we saw just last week pop up in Austin, where the Metro Planning Agency has proposed what they're calling autonomous rapid transit. And this is a really exciting idea to see. I mean, the technology doesn't even exist, but I think just by putting this scenario out there and having a real city buy into it in concept, we may see Daimler or Scania or one of the big bus manufacturers actually do the work to make it come to fruition. One of the really, I think, novel ideas that we put forth was what we call the MicroTransit Mesh. And you can see here an image of what are two different private driverless shuttle lines. Maybe one is serving a university and another serving a large employer, like a tech company. Meeting at a corner that's not really a designated bus stop and swapping passengers. And the idea here was that as these driverless shuttle vehicles become cheaper and cheaper, and operating them costs, really next to nothing, we're going to see a growing array of institutions, essentially property owners, put them into use to bring people to their sites. This is something that already happens. Where I live in Hudson County, New Jersey, every new condo development with more than 100 units runs its own shuttle service to take people to transit because they can't depend on New Jersey Transit to provide that last mile link, and it's absolutely essential to marketing their property. But hotels provide them, and schools provide them. Some of them, imagined there's all these empty seats running around. These lines are crisscrossing. They don't interconnect. Could we imagine, as happens in the developing world, where these networks evolve similarly, that they would, informally find a way to interconnect with digital technology? And so that's basically what we imagine happening here, is that there would be some kind of digital identity that if I'm a student of Cooper Union, I might be able to hop on Price Waterhouse's employee shuttle and come in from Brooklyn and then transfer to Cooper Union's shuttle for the last 10 blocks of my trip and be a trusted rider because of that digital identity and have an easy routing system all in there. And that a city could sort of stitch together a transit system out of these private networks. And this is really kind of a great example of what they call mobility as a service. So stitching together a coherent system from a bunch of fragmented little systems. And they were really dealing with what happens if automation produces this runaway success. This is an example of dealing with a problem, another example of dealing with a problem of automation. We're at a point in this country where pretty soon Amazon is probably going to make a play to establish a monopoly on delivery into the home. It's not clear what that's going to look like, but they more or less have a monopoly on delivery right now. More people subscribe to Amazon Prime than voted in the presidential election. I think among the income group that's probably represented in this room, we're probably at about 90% Amazon Prime subscription. I think Americans under $25,000 a year in income, it's still 30% subscription to Amazon Prime. So they really kind of own the American household right now. I think what we're moving towards is a world, what I'm calling continuous delivery, where people are just kind of clicking and forgetting when things are coming, and there's just a constant stream of packages. And then the flow is also going the other way. So returns are easy, effortless, and free. But it's a very centralized flow of goods. It's very energy and material intensive, and potentially could be disastrous in terms of the amount of carbon that's involved, from just a pure street management point of view, the amount of vehicles, regardless of what size they are, is going to be tremendous. If they're trucks, it's going to be a total disaster. If they're little delivery carts, we had another image from this scenario where we show the old lady coming down the stairs and the sidewalk is just swarming with little carts and she's freaked out. But what we imagined was bringing back the idea of a porter, that every neighborhood or every block ought to have somebody whose job it is to kind of coordinate that flow. And once that human being is put in place, they can become a hub in a different kind of local delivery economy. And that gives us a platform to think more about peer-to-peer exchange. So, what if those delivery bots could, instead of being used simply to move things from Amazon's fulfillment center to our homes, could be used to distribute goods from local farms, urban farms, to collect waste for composting, to support local manufacturing supply chains. Thinking of this not as the last mile of a global distribution chain, but as a kind of mesh in a peer-to-peer distribution system creates lots of new opportunities, new economic opportunities that can be used to support circular economy strategies that would be much lower energy intensity. And I think this is the last of the scenarios I'll put out here. There's one more, but it's not 100% relevant. I'm sure all of you have been seeing and following and possibly riding the scooter shares all around the country. I don't know if they arrived yet in New York City. No. They're coming. It's going to be a disaster here. It's totally, everybody knows that. It's just, I can't wait. Hopefully they'll arrive like in the middle of a blizzard, so it'll just be complete cataclysm. I'm really excited about them for one reason. I think that they have the potential to really augment all of the things that we've tried to achieve with transit-oriented development, and to do so in a really kind of profound mathematical way. So, the most expensive piece of transit-oriented development is the transit station, because you only really get to do it once, and then you're done. The impacts of transit stations on land values are stunningly small in radius. For like a heavy rail station, I don't know what the radius is. I think it's a half mile, a mile. Where I live in New Jersey, I live near a light rail line, and I think it's like a quarter mile to a half mile. And beyond that, like you can't even detect the impact on land values over the long term. It's like it's almost nothing. And that's because beyond that, people don't shift their travel patterns that much, or they don't shift it enough to be willing to pay for it. So what these vehicles do is they're superpowered feet. They give people the ability to move further and farther out from, that transit stop. I did the study. This was from the Reprogramming Mobility piece in 2014, and I was sort of imagining the scenario in Cambridge, Massachusetts, around the Central Square T station. And for those of you that are familiar with this part of Cambridge, it's called Cambridgeport. It's an area that's gentrified over the last 10 or 20 years, but not fully, because parts of it are still really quite far aside from the kind of ethics around the gentrification, just the reasons why it hasn't are because, parts of it are quite far from the T-stop. But once you bring bikes into the mix, parts of it become reachable. But not everybody can bike. It's an aging society, and some people need assistance. In Massachusetts winters, some people want to go a little faster than they can on a bike, and sometimes need an enclosure. And small electric vehicles, I think, provide another set of mobilities that are going to extend this last mile and give cities an opportunity to upzone not just the area right around the transit station, but the area beyond, and to pump more people into this low carbon infrastructure that they've already paid for. So, I don't know, I'm always looking for terms to capture these ideas. And, if we're calling it micro-mobility, that's what a lot of people are calling the scooters and the small electric vehicles, we'll call this micro-sprawl. This is the expansion of density from TOD areas into the surrounding city. So, there's a lot of possibilities. I think what I'm trying to show here is that the future of autonomous vehicles is not just about cars. It's not technology-driven, essentially. This is a programmable, malleable technology that we can fit into cities to achieve the goals that we have. There's going to be a lot of trade-offs. There's a lot of ways that we can unleash pent-up demand for travel in ways that really spikes the carbon reduction goals that we have. There are ways that we can divert it into more local, sustainable behaviors, and there are ways that we can manage it and thwart it. But there's some very powerful actors, and understanding their agendas and understanding, I think the time to shape their expectations is now, though, and that's why these kinds of visions are really, really important. So. I'm out of time. I just want to leave you with one more tool that we played with in the Bloomberg work to try to get into some more detail about what the land use implications might be. And it's basically the transect, which new urbanists used in the 90s to really help teach about density and how density could be deployed in different concentric rings in the city. And we were trying to look at these different density rings. It's an oversimplified model of the city, but what the impact of AVs might be. And we looked at both shared and private AVs in these different zones. And could you increase density? Would the parking move around? Would it be increased? Would it be decreased? Where would industry want to be if freight got cheaper to move? Where would housing want to be? And then, if you really want to beat yourself up, what happens when we have all-terrain automated vehicles out in the wilderness? Do all kinds of crazy things happen out there? Rem Koolhaas has been writing a lot about this lately, so you can imagine what kinds of crazy speculation he has. But I think it's a useful tool to try to, again, get past that sprawl or density, really simple binary thinking, and start to think in more detail. So these resources are out there. The one that I didn't mention is this atlas of pilots. If you want to see what cities are doing now and how they're talking about AVs in their strategic plans, there's probably about a dozen cities that have redone their mobility strategies in the last 2 years that now are addressing AVs in more and more detailed ways. And we have collected all these documents here in the atlas. And this is constantly being updated. So thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing this more on the panel. Thank you.